Hello, this is Avram Friedman reporting for the Canary Coalition on my visit to Standing Rock on November 17th and 18th, 2016. I write and narrate this report in greater awareness that I speak from the perspective of someone who has since birth benefited from the injustice of white privilege his entire life at the expense of indigenous Americans and other exploited and underprivileged peoples throughout America. My background in life as a Jewish American affords some intellectual insight into the nature of genocidal oppression, as I have been taught that a third of my tribal ancestry was murdered by another culture in an indifferent world less than a decade before I was born. But it is nothing that I have personally experienced in my lifetime. While vestiges and perhaps some deep undercurrents of anti-Semitism still exist in America and throughout the world, I have felt its personal manifestations in only a very minimal and relatively inconsequential manner. I apologize in advance to the elders and indigenous people of Standing Rock if I unwittingly step outside my boundaries in this report by misinterpreting, misinforming, or inappropriately reprioritizing the importance of statements, events, or realities I have witnessed during my brief stay at the Oseti-Sekowen campground. This journey began for me with an invitation from my niece to visit Seattle and join in a celebration in honor of my sister's 70th birthday and for the Thanksgiving holiday. It did not occur to me at that time that the Thanksgiving holiday to Native Americans represents the beginning of the genocidal period upon which the United States of America was founded, the greatest genocide ever to take place in human history, in which more than 20 million people were systematically exterminated to make room for the expansion of Western European civilization. I had already been seriously considering a trip to Standing Rock to participate in and document the struggle over the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. Now, I had two reasons to travel in a northwesterly direction. The target date for leaving from Sylva, North Carolina, my home, was November 15th. This would allow enough time to stop at Standing Rock for a few days, deliver donated supplies, and shoot some video footage before moving on to the West Coast. The plan further developed into a vision to organize a caravan from Western North Carolina to Standing Rock. As long as I was driving, why not invite others to help carry supplies and consider joining forces with the water protectors? The following days and weeks were spent learning from others who had been to Standing Rock about what was needed and expected from those planning to travel to the camps adjacent to the pipeline construction in North Dakota. I contacted Bill McKibben, who had spent some time there. I spoke with members of the Eastern Band of the Cherokee after the Tribal Council voted $50,000 to the Standing Rock Sioux Legal Fund and sent up truckloads of supplies. I attended a nonviolent civil disobedience training session specifically tailored to Standing Rock, held at the French Broad Food Co-op in Asheville. I listened, read, and learned as much as I could before beginning the journey. The caravan never materialized. There were others heading in that direction, but everyone had different time frames and schedules. A good friend, Yvonne Scott, and I left at the same time, but she had a specific mission in mind that required taking a different and less direct route to get to the Oseti-Sekowen camp. She traveled to the planned terminal hub of the Dakota Access Pipeline in southern Illinois and then followed the pipeline up to Cannonball, North Dakota, where the camps were situated. My road led through Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, and finally to the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation that straddles the border between South and North Dakota. Although I drove alone, many people contributed to my trip through direct donations, contributions to the Canary Coalition. The provisions I transported were not insignificant. 50 pounds of rolled oats, 25 pounds of brown rice, 25 pounds of lentils, 25 pounds of whole wheat flour, 5 gallons of sunflower oil, 15 pounds of sprouting seeds, 200 pairs of earbuds, 50 hand warmers, 6 propane canisters, 4 walkie-talkies, 6 pairs of safety glasses, various herbal salves and herbal remedies, several pairs of heavy wool socks, scarves, and ski caps, $275 in cash, and $300 in Lowe's cards for badly needed building materials. These goods were delivered and accepted with gracious appreciation from the people staffing the kitchen, the supply tent, and the medical camp. I had been warned, wisely, to approach the camp from the south rather than from the north through Bismarck, although the northern route provides more major and better roads. The police had set up roadblocks and checkpoints on routes 1806 and 24 leading to the camp from the north. Members of the press and those carrying video equipment were sometimes harassed and even arrested on trumped-up traffic violations. Cameras had been confiscated for no apparent legal reason. But from the south, 1806 crosses the state line within the reservation, and there are no checkpoints. I followed this advice and encountered no obstructions or police cars, fortunately. I had also been advised to enter the camp during the daylight hours rather than at night, because those receiving traffic at the entrance gate are directing all visitors to various stations to deliver donated goods and to different places of orientation, depending on the purpose of the new arrival. At night, some of these activity stations aren't in operation. Also at night, the camp is difficult to navigate, especially for someone who has just arrived and is unfamiliar with the layout. There are no street lights in the village that is Oseti-Sakowin. So, I carefully planned the trip to arrive early in the morning on Thursday, November 17th. Upon arrival, I was greeted at the gate and directed to the media tent, where I would be given a media pass and an orientation about what I could record and what was off limits. However, I arrived too early and the media tent wasn't yet up and running for the day. I got out of the car to join others who were waiting. It was cold and windy on the hill where the northern fence was located, overlooking the vast main camp in the river valley below, housing thousands of teepees, yurts, domes, trailers, and tents. Rather than sit in the cold, I put on my heavy coat, warm gloves, and a toboggan cap, and went for a walk through a main corridor dividing the camp lined with flags for many Indian nations. The temperature was in the low 20s with steady winds from 20 to 40 miles an hour, according to the local public radio station. More than 300 tribes are represented at this camp, as well as many environmental organizations, churches, civil rights organizations, ad hoc groups, and individuals. The northern fence itself houses hundreds of banners hailing the support of groups and organizations who have visited or maintain a presence at the camp. There were multiple fires at many campsites, people busily moving in all directions, performing tasks of daily survival, as well as for communal building and well-being. I stopped for a while at the sacred fire of the Oseti-Sakowin camp, which appeared to be the central outdoor meeting and information center of the village. 20 feet from the fire were a group of people reading and posting on a bulletin board, alive with hundreds of announcements and notifications. There was a master of ceremonies under an outdoor canopy relaying announcements over a loud sound system that could be heard in the background throughout much of the camp. I walked further down the corridor toward the Cannonball River that separated Oseti-Sakowin from the Rosebud and Sacred Stone campgrounds that are on undisputed Standing Rock Tribe territory. Oseti-Sakowin is located on federal land controlled by the Army Corps of Engineers. A temporary permit has been granted by the Army Corps for the encampment, although the status of the permit is tenuous and could be revoked at any time, leaving the thousands of people there vulnerable to the brutality of the local police and hired security guards of Energy Transfer Partners Incorporated, the company building the pipeline that challenges the sovereignty and threatens the water supply of the Standing Rock Tribe. The nonviolent civil disobedience actions have taken place in areas adjacent to and to the east of the Oseti-Sakowin camp, near where the Cannonball River empties into the Missouri. I walked along observing early morning activities among the tents and teepees lining the shores on both sides of the river. People had been up and moving since the break of dawn 4 or 5 hours earlier. I wandered into the medical camp, consisting of a semicircle of yurts surrounding an outdoor fire pit and a Quonset hut filled with supplies. There I found Liana Elizabeth Constantino, a Cherokee midwife who had offered me valuable guidance prior to the trip. She was sitting with another woman who had come from Maryland to volunteer at the camp. After a brief greeting and exchange of stories, I decided to use this waiting period to locate space and on the northern fence and hang the banners I brought from the Canary Coalition, Occupy WNC, and the Dogwood Alliance. The second woman, whose name now escapes me, I'm sorry, volunteered to help me perform this task. We hiked back up the hill to my car to retrieve the banners, and together in the strong, cold wind, it was all we could do to hold them in place long enough to tie them to the barbed wire fence. At about 10:30 a.m., I returned to the media tent that now had a line of 10 or 15 people awaiting orientation. When it was my turn, I was asked for identification to prove I was with a valid media organization. I was further asked to bring up the Canary Coalition's webpage on my cell phone to provide evidence that the organization was real and operating as I stated. This is because there are spies and provocateurs infiltrating the camp, listening to strategy sessions, taking prohibited photographs and video footage for the purpose of disruption and undermining the peacefulness and prayerfulness of the camps and the actions. I gladly complied and was given a press ID pass to wear on my coat. Then a group of us were given an orientation by one of the media staff. We were informed that it is strictly prohibited to take close-up photographs or video footage of any of the sacred fires in any of the camps unless granted specific permission. Likewise, for any councils, the medical tents, food preparation areas, group camps, or campfires, no people or activities are to be recorded without their express permission. No background sounds such as drumming or chanting are to be published on Facebook, YouTube, or any other social media, video report, or documentary unless granted permission by the elders. We could conduct interviews with willing and consenting individuals. We could scan the campground from a distance. We could photograph and video record the Cannonball River and connecting waterways. We could record the actions and confrontations with police if we were willing to risk arrest. Since I had other commitments and was not prepared to risk arrest on this trip, my opportunities for shooting video footage were very limited. The best I could do was to seek out some interesting interviews, but first I had to get myself situated and set up camp. This would prove to be not as simple as I had anticipated. Finding a spot was easy enough. I drove down the main corridor of Oseti-Sakowin to the northern bank of the Cannonball River. Looking for a space, I happened upon a Native American man who was in the process of packing up his tent and loading his pickup truck to leave. He said I could have his space, and I lent him a hand in breaking down. The wind was strong, constant, and frigid. It threatened to rip his now unstaked tent out of our hands that were clumsily gloved to protect from frostbite. It was all we could do to roll it up into a manageable ball and get it into the back of his truck so he could leave. He thanked me, then had to depart because he had a long drive ahead of him and wanted to avoid the darkness. It began to get dark at about 4:30 in the afternoon. It was already approaching 2 p.m. by the time I began to set up camp. My plan was to put down the back seat and sleep in the car, but I would have to set up the tent to house all the equipment and belongings that were taking up the space in the back seat and in the trunk. The weather forecast called for possible snow that night. Putting up the tent was extremely difficult. There was no one to help, as everyone nearby had their hands full keeping their own tents and possessions intact. It took fully an hour and a half to stake down a ground tarp, then the tent, as the merciless wind roared and yanked the nylon fabric like a powerful kite that wanted to take flight. It was a battle to stake one corner, then another, then reposition it to stretch to the full shape of a tent. I decided to move the car to attempt to partially block the wind. It helped a little. Somehow, I managed to get the poles through the loops of the misshaped pattern and raise the structure of that bent and collapsed repeatedly in the torrent until all the supporting members were in place, more or less. I prayed for the stakes to hold while I retrieved a 3-gallon jug of water from the car to place on the floor inside the tent to prevent the structure from being ripped away. Then, one piece at a time, I moved backpacks, suitcases, food storage, and everything else from the car into the tent. I then put down the back seat that opened up into the trunk of the car, providing a flat space barely long enough to accommodate my body. My 66-year-old body was stiff. My hands, legs, and jaw were not working fluidly anymore, rigidified by the frigid air temperature. I hadn't intended to retire this early in the evening, but exhausted, cold, and wind-whipped, I crawled into my sleeping bag as darkness descended. The sleeping bag cocoon would keep me warm, but I was not able to find a comfortable position on the hard surface in the back of my car. Sleeping in fits with the howling wind rocking my shelter, I spent most of the night planning for the following day. I would walk through the 3 camps with my camera in hand, searching for interviews. I would try to find a doctor at the medical tent, an attorney at the legal tent, a teacher, a cook, a spiritual leader, some volunteers, people who had been arrested. I continually repositioned myself restlessly throughout the night, surviving with little sleep, but at least protected from the cold and wind. I was awakened at daybreak by women chanting down by the river. There was a sacred ceremony at the river at the beginning of each day. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, refreshing, somehow defiant and rejoicing of the elements at once. I was in awe of those who were able to awaken and participate despite the bitter cold and wind. The temperature was now 17 degrees according to my thermometer. A little bit later, reluctantly, I emerged from my sleeping bag, struggled to get my clothes and hiking boots on, and against all instincts, opened the car door to expose myself to the rawness of the open air. Now that my body had been warmed overnight, it didn't feel quite as biting outside, and I hopped out with some determination to make the best of this day. After availing myself of a nearby porta potty, I grabbed my video camera, mounted it on the tripod, slung it on my shoulder, and began a long pilgrimage on foot that would take me through all 3 camps, in several hours into the early afternoon. The air of deep and meaning spirituality was present everywhere I traversed. Every sound I heard resonated with meaning, purpose, determination, prayer, thankfulness, camaraderie, brotherhood. There was a sense of sacredness at each campground, each fire, each circle, each dwelling. For much of the day, I forgot entirely about the camera I was carrying, understanding that almost all I was witnessing was off limits to recording. There were dozens of people working hard preparing food within the semi-dark large tent of the main community kitchen at Oseti Sakhoin. There were people loading newly arrived food and provisions at the camp's supply tent, kitchen, and medical tent. There were people unloading, cutting, and splitting firewood from large truckloads that were arriving. There were many who were building shelters, some from standard 2x4s, plywood, and roofing materials. Some were erecting teepees and tarpies, yurts, domes, and camping tents. Hammering and sawing could be heard throughout the camps, even as the cold could freeze your hands to metal, and the wind could mercilessly carry away a 4x8 sheet of OSB board from 2 men standing on ladders. But there is no complaining. There is only prayer at Standing Rock. Every action, every word is a part of the prayer. Individual prayer and communal prayer. The work, the counsels, the nonviolent civil disobedience is all part of the prayer. The power of this place and time is palpable, even from a physical distance as I write and read this report. I didn't realize before I arrived what it was that caused me to come to gather support and bring provisions, to help build support for the people at Standing Rock. But now I understand that is the power of the ongoing and growing prayer that is emanating from this place, the combined and synergistic energy and determination of the people, the tribes, the men, women, and children that is broadcasting through the fabric of the universe, that is pulsing and causing a throbbing in the hearts of people throughout the country and the world, that is causing activists, celebrities, politicians to come to this remote, forbidding corner of the earth, defying hostile and brutal police and authorities, defying severe and brutal weather conditions, following their hearts and their consciences to sacrifice the now for the sake of humanity, for the sake of future generations, for the sake of all life on earth, for the sake of preserving the good that is left on earth, to fend off the dark age that could be descending upon our planet and replacing it with the hope that we can instead put forth the vision that will result in a new age of awareness, social, economic, and environmental responsibility, justice, and caring for one another. My first destination was the medical tent. I entered the midwifery yurt after asking permission to enter as instructed. There were several people busily working, and I asked if there was someone willing to be interviewed. One doctor said he would, but he was busy at the moment. He asked that I come back at about 1 p.m. I took note of that and made my way up to the legal tent at the top of the hill, near the entrance to Oseti Sakhoin. Everyone at the legal tent was busy helping people who had just returned from jail or had returned for a court date. There were people waiting in line to speak to all the attorneys who were volunteering their services. Come back later, I was told. Okay, I will, I said. Then I hiked over the bridge that spanned the Cannonball River over the western end of the camps from Oseti Sekoin to Rosebud and Sacred Stone. I came to the community kitchen in Rosebud, where they were preparing to serve the first meal of the day to the children who are attending the school that has been set up at the camp. All the workers were busy, as were those in charge. You'll need to try later, I was told, in a friendly, sympathetic, but certain manner. Determinedly, I marched on in my quest. I came to a camp where there was a cluster of identical wood stoves and packaged tar peas. There was a man nearby breaking down a tent. I asked him if he knew about the wood stoves and the tar peas. Yes, he said. He and some others had made them and brought them to give away. I gave him a hand breaking down his tent, and then he agreed to a short interview. All right, if you'd like, you can give me your name.
Okay, my name's Wiz. They call me Wiz for obvious reasons. Wiz Garber.
What is the obvious reason?
Because I look like one, I guess.
Because you look like a whiz. I thought maybe because you're a technological whiz as well.
I was that too. I was an IT expert for years and years. I did system administrative work.
So you have brought 20 stoves? How many?
We brought 40 wood stoves, just like this one here. They're made out of 30-gallon drums, and then there's a kit that we get that puts the door on it and the top and the legs. We put all that together, and then we brought all these stovepipes.
Yeah.
And the whole thing costs about $100. So you can heat one of these lodges for about $100, and we brought 40 of those. They're from Seattle. They were assembled in Seattle by volunteers, and we brought them across land. It took us about 32 hours to get here, nonstop.
Did somebody donate the materials, or these are your donations?
It's there's a GoFundMe where people donate, and they're donating for the wood stoves plus the lodges, all the materials for the lodges. There are about, I've heard, at least 100 families here in the camps that don't have any residence. They don't have any place to stay and be warm at night. So the point is to try to erect as many of these lodges as quickly as we can to for the elderly and for the kids, women and children, and that's our main mission. So we brought 40, and I just got a load of lumber last night, about 2 tons of 2x4s to build these. The natives call these tarpies because they're sort of a white man version of their teepees. They're not open at the top. They're sealed at the top by a plywood circle. And we have the stove pipe going up through the middle of that. And then we have a mylar, not a mylar, but a plastic tarp that's wrapped around it. And so far it seems to hold the heat pretty well, and it stands up to the winds. We'll see whether it's going to be as good as the old-fashioned teepees that are out here next to us. But so far it's holding up. It's pretty strong winds at the moment.
Yeah.
And it's pretty cold out right now, but it's pretty warm inside here.
It is. I can testify. So you came with a group of people in a caravan from Seattle.
Yes. Mm-hmm. It's a group called the Cascadia Group. Cascadia is an organization that's working to establish sustainable communities. And we're also here to support the people at Standing Rock. So we had a bus full of people and 2 vans, and then a big panel truck bringing all the wood stoves and all the other supplies that we brought.
And how long have you been here?
We've been here for a week, and we're leaving now, and I'm hoping to tie up my loose ends back in Seattle so that I can come back and be here for the duration of the winter, because they need as many people as they can here.
What have you seen here? Is there anything particular that has inspired you, or tell me what you've seen?
The really inspiring part has to do with the spiritual attitude of the locals. This entire camp is a spiritual camp. It's a prayerful camp. Everything that they do is prayerful. There's what they're trying to do to stop the pipeline is prayerful. They wake up in the morning and they do a prayer ceremony. There are sacred fires at each of the 3 camps that are lit and have been lit 24 hours a day, and they're manned by a medicine person, and you can go to any of those sacred fires and sit in ceremony with them at any time for prayer. There's a sweat lodge right around the corner here in this camp. There's one in each camp. It's like the local church on the corner. I did a sweat with the natives here day before yesterday, and that was very eye-opening. They welcomed me into their local Lakota ceremony. Many years ago, that wouldn't have been possible, but that has changed. They're welcoming what they call the rainbows into their circles to prayer. Just about everybody that you talk to is extremely dedicated, and it's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to get here in the first place, and it's not an easy thing to endure what you have to endure here. I haven't had a shower the entire time I've been here. So it's very inspiring. I went to Bismarck yesterday to get lumber, and to go back to Bismarck from this place was very eye-opening, because you're going back to strip malls, and you're going back to white man's society. You're going back to where you have to have money to exchange for things, and where people are working just to make money. And here, there is no money. Everybody shares what they have. You walk. There's a food kitchen down here. When you need to eat, they cook meals. They cook 3 meals a day, and they feed everybody that walks in the door. There's a donation tent for all kinds of clothing, sweaters, boots, blankets. If you need something, you walk into the tent and you take it. If you have something to leave, you leave it. I left 8 or 10 sweaters over here just a minute ago because I'm leaving back to Seattle and somebody else can use those. These people have a lot to teach us. So we need to open our eyes and listen to what they say. Listen to the wisdom of their elders. These people, this culture is a lot older than our own. And we have suppressed them.
Is there anything else you would like to say? Have you, when you came back from Bismarck, did you have to go through a checkpoint? Did the police stop you?
There were some police on the road pulling some people over, but they didn't stop us. I haven't personally had any problem getting through. Some people I know have been pulled over, but I'm not really sure, what their criteria is. I've heard lots of stories about the authorities' behavior that just astounds me. How they can get away with the way they treat people here they would never be able to treat people that way in, the places where I've lived, the big cities, Seattle, New York, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles. The police are accountable. I think here it's sort of accepted that these native people can be treated this way. And that has to change. And the only way it's going to change is by us making the rest of the country know that these things are going on.
Have you witnessed any of the action and the arrests that have taken place? Have you risked arrest yourself?
I've been concentrating on housing the people and keeping them warm. There are other people in our group that go to the actions. There's at least an action every day. Some kind of direct action where they put the people on the front line and expose themselves to possible arrest. One of our group was arrested. He was on the front line holding arms with some other people, and the two people on both sides of him were not arrested, but he was arrested. He's a kind of a big guy, and two people brought him down very violently, from what I understand from the accounts that I've heard, with very little explanation for why they singled him out and let other people go. And the charge was something like it was a misdemeanor for trespassing or something like that, which at least it wasn't a felony. But he was in jail for 2 or 3 days, I guess, before they could bail him out. The legal team here at the camp bailed him out, which was lucky. There's a woman from Seattle named Danielle Janety. Excuse me. She's my inspiration for being here because she came here before, about 10 days, 2 weeks before me. She invited me to come. She invited me to drive the truck. She was bringing these 2 weeks before us, and I couldn't come. She came with another driver, and on October 27th, they were out there on the front camp where they were trying to take back some of the 1851 treaty land, and the authorities swept through the camp with armed, mercenaries, basically. It was a militarized police force with Humvees and armored trucks, and with police carrying M16s against peaceful, non-armed people who were praying with a peace pipe. Not only that, but they were women. And so we're doing an interview in here. So the police swept through this crowd. There was a circle of women, elders, and they were praying with a pipe. And there were a couple people protecting them from the line of police that were coming in, and Danielle was one of them. The police came around the circle of elderly women and kept pushing the rest of the people back, and then they proceeded to arrest all of the women that were praying peacefully with a pipe, and Danielle was one of them. There were 140 people arrested. Many women, many men. They separated the men and the women. The women had to suffer a lot of indignities. Some of them were strip searched. I don't think it went as far as a body cavity search, but almost, for praying, for peaceful praying. She was in jail for 4 or 5 days, I guess, was finally bailed out. And it's her story, people like her who walk their talk, that inspired me to come here. it's one thing to talk and sympathize, and it's quite another thing to come here and put your life on the line. And these people are doing it daily, and they're not armed, they're peaceful, and they're prayerful. And they're being confronted by armed thugs.
Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Come to Standing Rock and stand with the people.
Afterward, Wiz introduced me to others in his camp, and I connected with some great people. But they were all involved in activities that didn't allow enough time for me to interview them. I then hiked about a half a mile up the road to the Sacred Stone campground. Upon entering the gate, a sign informed me that absolutely no photography or videography was permitted of the dwellings or the people within the camp. I asked a man who was working in an equipment shed if there was anything I could capture on video from a distance. There was a statue overlooking the water I could capture with my camera. The waterways are also okay to record. Unfortunately, I couldn't find anyone who knew the significance of the statue. I'm sure there's a meaningful story behind this sculpture, and perhaps someone who is viewing this can fill in this information gap. This footage of the waterways and beyond provides a perspective of the area where the pipeline is being built in the distance, although the pipeline itself cannot be seen. It was now afternoon, and I had to get back to the medical tent at Oseti Sakoin for my 1 o'clock interview with the doctor. I slowly walked back along the river encampment part of Sacred Stone, marveling at all the activity, wishing that I had more time and could become more a part of it all. As I passed by on my way back from Rosebud Camp, I noticed 2 banners prominently posted that I thought were worth capturing. Then I looked up at the sky and noticed a helicopter circling the camp. I was told that helicopters and drones are seen constantly circling the camp. Sometimes at night it's suspected that sprays are being released on the camp, although this has not been confirmed. More than a little weary, I arrived back at the medical camp, where I found Michael Dan Knutson, a media person who has been issuing regular reports from Standing Rock on Facebook, and who I corresponded with before coming to North Dakota. I asked him if he could suggest someone to interview in the medical camp. Just then, the doctor who I had spoken to earlier appeared from inside one of the yurts. Michael reached out to him and asked if he could do an interview with me now, but he was very busy and said, "No, not really, sorry." Then Michael approached another doctor who had just finished her shift and was about to get in her car and go to Bismarck for some supplies. She agreed to an interview, to my great appreciation. But as I was setting up the camera and introducing myself to her, a woman dazedly stumbled by a few feet away from us, obviously in some physical and/or mental distress. The doctor looked at her and asked, "Are you okay?" When there was no response, she quickly went over, put her arm around the woman, and began the process of taking care of her, disappearing into one of the yurts. I waited for 15 minutes and the doctor never came out. I began to realize that I probably wasn't going to be able to create the video documentary I had envisioned, and that maybe what I was trying to do isn't really what's needed at Standing Rock. What is needed is people who are willing and committed to stay and participate, to either join in the actions and get arrested or become an active part of the support structure in the camps. No one said this to me. There was no hostility to me for being there, but I began feeling that if I wasn't on the front lines or in the kitchen cutting vegetables or splitting firewood or volunteering in the medical camp or providing some other needed service, I was really just in the way and serving no valuable purpose. I had obligations to be elsewhere and couldn't settle in to get involved in some regular activity. My trip up there had served the valuable purpose of delivering the provisions and donations I had collected for the camp. Now it was time to get out of the way and let everyone do the work they had to do. So I went back to my car and campsite and began the arduous task of taking down the tent, again fighting against the torturous coldness and wind. As I began the task, a Native American group parked in a campsite next to me and began erecting a large tent they retrieved from the supply tent. One of the men asked if I had any extra tent stakes because their tent was lacking them. I didn't have any extras, but I gave him all the stakes from my tent since I was no longer using them. They were struggling with the wind, just as I had the day before, so I went over to help. With my bare hands on the metal stakes, I pushed and hammered the stakes into the ground, and I could swear as I was doing this, warmth entered into my fingers and strength returned to my body. In these brief moments of physically contributing to the building of the community, I felt a spirit entering my being that filled me and made me feel connected to all others in the camp. I at once felt strong regret that I could not stay to help more, to build, to share, to fight, to suffer the cold and wind, to risk arrest, to pray with all these brothers and sisters. But it was not to be, at least not this time. As I prepared to get in my car and leave, a woman with a child approached me. "Hey, I like the Bernie sticker on your car." We got into a conversation and she told me about her journey from Maine. She and her daughter had been at Standing Rock for 3 weeks, mostly helping in the kitchen. She told me that Robert Kennedy Jr. had been there 2 days before and slept in the teepee about 30 feet from my tent. It was a special teepee that many visitors had shared, and the canvas was covered with signatures in permanent marker of hundreds of people who had visited Oseti Sekoen, including many celebrities. She invited me to go over with her to sign it. I told her I wasn't a celebrity, and she said it didn't matter. So I went over and added my name to the mosaic about a foot under Robert Kennedy's signature. Shortly thereafter, I got in the car and began to drive toward the exit of the camp, deciding to stop once again at the legal tent just to see if by chance I could find an attorney to interview. There were 15 to 20 people online waiting just to get in to the legal tent. I got back into the car and drove away, feeling like there was a big gob of stretching putty on my spine trying to pull me back. I kept going, but the gravitational force of Standing Rock is still exerting itself on my soul. Dramatic things have taken place in a few days since I left Standing Rock. The police used water cannons, rubber bullets, and other heartless and harsh weapons against peaceful water protectors, men, women, and children, sending hundreds to hospitals. The Army Corps of Engineers announced they were revoking the camping permit for the land on which Oseti Sakhalin is located, then backed down and said they had no plans to forcibly remove the camp. The governor of North Dakota threatened to forcibly remove the camp, then backed down. Neil Young arrived to serenade the water protectors. Jane Fonda cooked Thanksgiving dinner for the masses. Then, in a possibly game-changing moment, 2,000 military veterans arrived to stand between the rabid police and the water protectors, shaming the sheriff, the governor, the federal government, and the pipeline builders, magnified on all the national and international news networks for all to see. I was never more proud of anywhere wearing military uniforms. The next day, the Army Corps of Engineers announced they would not issue a permit for the pipeline to be completed on its current route, and that there would have to be an environmental impact study before determining where the pipeline could be rerouted. Don't tell me the people don't have power when we stand together. This is far from over, of course. The issue is not just the question of where the Dakota Access Pipeline is routed. The issue is the question of indigenous rights versus the expansion of corporate profits by exploiting sacred tribal lands. The issue is the question of the protection of all freshwater sources everywhere, because water is life. The issue is the existence of any new pipeline or any new fossil fuel infrastructure anywhere at all in the face of the worldwide scientific community's consensus that we have to rapidly phase out the burning of fossil fuels if we are to have any hope of mitigating climate change and avoiding its worst consequences. Standing Rock will go down in history as a turning point in the battles over indigenous and all human rights, in the recognition of the importance of preserving fresh water supplies for all of humanity and for all life, and in the struggle to transform away from the use of fossil fuels to preserve our climate and our world for future generations. This is Avram Friedman for the Canary Coalition. Power to the people.